And I thought this was the right moment just to focus on this market that has so much potential. It has a desperate need for clean energy.
Welcome back to the Excellence in Global Offshore Wind podcast. My guest today, Alessandro Antonioli, is CEO of Copenhagen Offshore Partners, Vietnam. With a background of energy giant BP and GE, and now leading the industrial engine behind the massive Lagon project, Alessandro has a unique view on what it takes to bridge the gap between a government roadmap and spinning turbines.
We created the right conditions for a new industry to thrive that contributes to the sustainable transition of this country. What the clean energy industry could learn from oil and gas has to do with a kind of sense of discipline that you have in oil and gas. You need to have a lot of attention to details when it comes to design.
Welcome back to the Excellence in Global Offshore Wind podcast. I'm your host, Philip Bassil. Today, we're heading to the frontier. We're talking about a market with world-class wind, a massive industrial appetite, and the potential to become the crown jewel of Southeast Asia's energy transition. We're talking about Vietnam. But building a 3.5 gigawatt offshore wind project in an emerging market isn't just about engineering. It's about navigating a complex web of policy, finance, and local partnerships. My guest today is the man at the center of that storm. Alessandro Antonioli is CEO of Copenhagen Offshore Partners, Vietnam. With a background of energy giant BP and GE, and now leading the industrial engine behind the massive Lagon project, Alessandro has a unique view on what it takes to bridge the gap between a government roadmap and spinning turbines. Alessandro, welcome to ExGOW.
Hello, Philip. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Alessandro, we're talking a lot about the what and the how of the Lagon project, the steel, the billions, and the bureaucracy. But I want to talk a bit about your background first.
I'm an engineer by background, so I wanted to work as an engineer in the energy sector. So right after university, I joined General Electric, and I started to design some power plants and transmission projects across Europe. And that was my way of getting exposed to the latest technology in the space of generation, power generation, and HVDC as well. And I saw the first very large converter station, the very first offshore substation. So that was, let's say, my training into the energy sector. And I started from power. Then I shifted with BP. I shifted across the value chain, and I've been exposed to a variety of businesses, a variety of technologies and products, spanning from jet fuel to lubricants to crude oil, EV charging points, and ultimately, I was one of the people who built the renewable energy business of BP more recently, that delivered the pipeline of more than 90 gigawatts of projects across the world. And eventually, I moved. I worked for CIP's service company, Copenhagen Offshore Partners, and here in Southeast Asia, that I find it's an extremely exciting region for the energy transition, as you rightly mentioned.
What was it that convinced you that this was the right place to be leading, in Vietnam in 2026 for offshore wind?
I've been watching Vietnam for many years, at least since 2021. And I saw the hubris of that era, with plenty of concessions being given to small energy developers. And I also saw the crash that followed that period because there was just too much capacity allocated too early in a pretty chaotic way. And then what happened was a political transition. They took several years. So there's been a bit of a stasis in the country in terms of decision making for many years. But I thought last year that this was the moment to come back, as we were approaching the change of leadership at the party level. Because for our listeners, Vietnam is a single party, I would say, oligarchy or democracy, depends how you look at it, but it's a single party political system, and therefore everything, all the inputs in terms of strategy, long-term planning come from the Communist Party, and I thought this was the right moment now just to focus on this market that has so much potential, and it has a desperate need for.
Alessandro, for our listeners who see, logos or hear of the logos of CIP, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, the world's largest dedicated greenfield renewable fund manager, and then COP, Copenhagen Offshore Partners, where you are, more the industrial engine that actually develops and operates the projects. Tell us a bit about how does the partnership give you an edge over traditional utilities, and how do the two CIP and COP work?
Yeah, so Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners is, as you said, is a fund manager. So it's effectively some people who decided that their investment thesis hinges around energy transition, and they want to deliver value to those that believe in a more sustainable world by giving them also sustainable returns. Therefore, the best way for them to operate is through a number of operating companies that actually provide the engineering, they provide the management, they provide the structure, the know-how for delivering greenfields and for managing brownfield projects. So one of these companies is Copenhagen Offshore Partners, but there are others, like there is CIP Molecules, for example, that is dedicated to hydrogen. There is CIP Terra that is dedicated to onshore, and there is a lot of cross collaboration between these companies. So in the end, we are all part of the same Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners family. We're just different dedicated, let's say, service companies that do the job on the ground. And I have to say that the focus of CIP remains greenfield, because that's the area where we think we can capture the highest amount of value, and because CIP is very uniquely positioned in the fact that they are focused on energy, but specifically on green energy, and they are a private company, so they don't feel the pressure of public companies in having to display results on a quarterly basis. And I speak coming from the experience of public companies that had to adjust the strategy based on the requirements of their investors base. And working for a fund means that you have patient capital behind you, ready to be deployed within the right investment frame. And therefore, in certain growth countries like Vietnam, we can take a very long stance. We can just minimize the capital expenditure, but stay in the country, working with the local industry and the local policymakers to mature the markets, to develop the right regulations before we deploy the big capital. And there are many growth countries that have similar stories. Just sometimes it's just difficult to nail the timing of it.
That's a very good point, Alessandro. And that's where, as an independent developer owned by a manager, talk a bit more about the competitive advantage that COP has when it's operating in frontier markets like Vietnam compared to an other developer or even state-owned giants.
COP has been hugely successful in Taiwan, and that has given a lot of confidence to COP to expand pretty rapidly around the world. That's because once you have some installed capacity and you've gone through development, construction, operating cycle for a few times, you really have the right processes, systems, and people for just replicating what you've done across the globe, especially if you come from frontier markets that are quite different from those that are more established, like Europe, for example. So finding talent in Asia was and remains still not as easy. And therefore, having this operating engine that brings capabilities from all over the world helps to get a steady delivery no matter where, just because the knowledge is there. It's historical, it's consolidated, and we've gone through many iterations of relations with suppliers, with partners, with governments, and therefore we know what to expect. And one of the things that really struck me working for COP is the level of attention they put into refining the business case, and how many resources they deploy, and how much they are able to interact with the supply chain on the basis of their long-lasting relationship that they have in some geographies. And therefore, this leads to a much more transparent relationship with them.
Maybe for some of our listeners that are not familiar, give us a little bit of recap what COP has done in Taiwan and the type of successes and projects.
COP has been one of the first developers, I think, with Ørsted of the Phemmiao offshore wind farm. And now we are heading towards, that was Phemmiao 1, now we're heading towards Phemmiao 3, right? And many other projects. So those are gigawatts and gigawatts of projects in an immature market. And, there is the parallel of Taiwan with the likes of Korea and to some extent Vietnam, in the fact that there was no supply chain that could actually support this new industry. Therefore, the first developers had to take a big risk into envisioning the project without knowing who would supply the parts and the services. And the initial ones like CIP and Ørsted were really pioneers in supporting the local supply chain because of the local content, and encouraging foreign companies to come and establish their operations in this new market. And alongside that, it wasn't just a matter of steel and concrete. There was no familiarity with the concept of project finance for offshore wind. And therefore, there was an extensive education process on this topic, and local banks worked very closely with the first developers to develop the right frame for it.
Vietnam is often called the next Taiwan of offshore wind. Beyond the incredible wind speeds, often more than 9 meters a second, as we know. What are the underlying characteristics, the economic or industrial, that make it, this market so attractive among its peers in APAC?
So it's attractive for the following reasons. You rightly mentioned the resources or what they are. The morphology is extremely good. You have fairly high wind speed, very shallow waters, not too far from shore. It's mostly fixed bottom. That means you don't need to spend too much in capex as you would, for example, in Japan. That is mostly a floating market, floating foundations market. But aside from that, if you look specifically at industrial apparatus that you have, Vietnam had a long established offshore oil and gas industry. And through that industry, the local yards have developed the capability, the knowledge of manufacturing offshore artifacts, specifically large jackets, platforms. And we had the possibility to test the quality of their work by procuring from them some of our offshore substations. And we could test firsthand that actually they are pretty good. And therefore, they have a fairly established knowledge base that now has become a strategic pillar of growth for the local energy industry, also because they have limited hydrocarbon resources. And they do see that through the manufacturing part, the offshore engineering capabilities that they have, they can actually continue prepare the incredible growth of their enterprises. To some extent, I have to say, Taiwan wasn't as developed as Vietnam in terms of engineering capabilities for offshore specifically. It's probably more akin, I'd say, North Sea countries, where there is a very good knowledge. It's more like Norway in a way, where there is that kind of offshore wind, offshore engineering knowledge that just waits to be deployed. In terms of financial system, however, it is a little bit behind what Taiwan was at the beginning, definitely behind Korea, and therefore will require more work than those jurisdictions. Also, because I think there is more resistance into currency. For example, there is less acceptance of foreign currency as a way of compensation for the power purchase agreement. There is also more resistance into the form of guarantees that are required in order to have bankable PPA. So there is much more work to be done on the project finance side, on the PPA side, and the support of DFIs and international banks would be fundamental.
We're going to talk a bit more about the financing and the structuring, but tell us, what is PDP-8?
I'd say something that was expected for many years, and when it came, no one believed in it. It was a bit of a chimera. It was something that it was the power development plan that should have established the amount of each power generation technology and in general energy sources you have in the energy system of the country in the medium and long term. And everyone has been waiting for it as it would have been eventually a watershed moment in the energy system of the country. But when it came out, and I think now it's 2 years ago, probably 3 years ago, not much happened. So this Phantomatic Power Development Plan 8 established the vision for the energy system of the country. It was indeed bold. I think it was built into huge aspirational growth for the country. However, not much happened after the Power Development Plan 8 has been approved. It took another 2 to 3 years to have what they call the PDP-8 implementation plan. It actually starts to give a little bit more clarity on what specific projects are prioritized. And this includes new technologies that were not in the country for a while, like nuclear, for example. Now there are 2 nuclear plants in the energy mix. The quotas for LNG has increased. And then you have the dismissal of coal, but giving a certain time frame for that, and the obligation of retrofitting coal plants with coal and gas plants with hydrogen burning turbines over time. So I think it's an extremely forward-looking document. I think it brings all the right lessons from other energy markets, and now we need to see the implementation of it. And there are still some questions, because fundamentally you have a strong pipeline of projects and developers that have been waiting for starting construction of their projects for many years, but without an off-taker that is bankable, all the good intentions don't lead you very far.
And I want to dig in a bit more there. We can't ignore, obviously, the hurdles, whether it's permitting of the early stage surveys or the grid availability to absorb, 6 gigawatts by 2030, which is very ambitious. What keeps you up at night when you're looking at the Lagan project?
It's all of the above, effectively. Like, there isn't, I think what has been for me quite encouraging is the industry, local industry commitment. When I see large state-owned enterprises investing into the supply chain for offshore wind, means that, and these are directly linked to the government, it means that they are part of an industrial strategy. So I would like to say that's the thing that give us developers encouragement, that we are aligned in terms of vision and in terms of willingness to progress the industry with the government. What still keeps me awake at night is, I think, the difficulty of the Vietnamese economic system to fully open up to international investment and fully allow I'll say, international capital to flow in, flow out, being able to freely invest without too many controls, too many limitations. And that's still a bit up in the air, and we receive usually some contradicting messages. For example, around currency hedging and around, for example, what legal system to adopt in the contracts with with government, because obviously foreigners are much more comfortable with an international recognized dispute center instead of having to rely on the Vietnamese system. But understandably, the government would want. So there are things that still, are not really fully sorted. But I think we've seen progress. At least now there is a dialogue. There are real projects that have been awarded, or at least partially awarded, on which you can have a dialogue. So we are moving now from the intentions stated in the PPAs and later in higher programmatic regulations, like the various resolutions at the party level, at the National Assembly level. Now we are getting into the decrease level, and very soon we get into negotiations mode for the key strategic projects of the country. And that would be, I think, the moment of truth, and you would really see what's the level of support that the state wants to give to this energy transformation.
That makes a lot of sense. If we look at the business case for offshore wind in Vietnam, talk a bit about the demand dynamics.
Yes, well, demand is relentlessly growing, just because this is one of those countries that has been the venue for diversifications of supply chain and hedging of supply chain risk from other countries. And Vietnam has been extremely reliable in that sense. It's been a really safe port for the manufacturing of semiconductors, of textiles, food, pretty much anything from electronics to consumer goods. It has a manufacturing hub in Vietnam. And this continuous displacement of manufacturing capacity here has created massive increase of demand for power. However, the demand is higher than the supply. So a lot of investments at the moment are on hold, just because they are not sure that actually they can get security of supply. The grid is congested. The country mostly rely on import of hydrocarbons, therefore with fluctuating price and very scarce infrastructure for harboring liquefied gas. So it has been in an energy semi-crisis limbo for many years, probably a decade, and there hasn't been yet the kind of response that is necessary. There is the ambition of moving from about 90 gigawatts of installed capacity of power as we stand now to 400 in a matter of 15 years. But we and I think this is in line with the central case of GDP growth that has been, I think it's expected to be between 4 and 6%. So this is quite realistic in a way, but we haven't seen the acceleration of consenting for new power projects. So there is the risk that this could damage further the GDP growth of the country. But there is awareness, and I think when you hear the speeches of the leaders, they all talk about the necessity for sustainable green energy to support the expected growth, and now is actually 10% as target from this year onward.
And you touched on a lot of important points there, but I want to reiterate. So you're saying the target is to go from 90 gigawatts to 400 gigawatts in 15 years.
That's what's in the PPA. So.
Exactly. I think it's important to reiterate, and that's really supported by GDP growth and demand outstripping supply. How much of that do you think will be offshore wind for Vietnam?
Well, there is 6 gigawatts from here to 2032. and then there is another 14 to 30. Sorry, and then there is 14 until 2035. This is what's been projected. I would expect probably you will see half of it by 2035. So probably you will see 6-7 gigawatts by 2035. And I think the remaining part, once these 6 gigawatts are established, you will see much, much faster growth, because at that point you will have a credible pipeline, you will have established supply chain. So moving from the first 7 gigawatts to the planned, I think 50 gigawatts by 2050 is possible. But you just need to build confidence in the market by accelerating the first projects, giving the right support measures, and giving credible pipeline to international suppliers to come and establish their operations here.
Absolutely. As you mentioned, COP has had huge success in Taiwan. What are the biggest Taiwan lessons you're applying to Vietnam to avoid the pitfalls of high localized costs and grid integration delays?
Well, I think localization is one of the positive side effects of starting a new industry. However, it comes with many pitfalls, because there is no country that can provide every component of the supply chain. And those who tried to do that failed miserably. And the forest, I think even Taiwan learned from their lessons, and they adjusted a little bit target. There is an element of not thinking that there can be a continuous race to the bottom, and just you need to engage with the local supply chain and realistically map it and see what they can do, what they cannot do, what will need to be imported, and just work on those business assumptions very transparently with local authorities. I think that's a good lessons learned, as we are in another part of the world where you have access to pretty competitive supply chain. There's local, but it's also the regional, because we are not far from China, and we know they can also supply quite competitively. So I think the lessons is to speak transparently within um, uh, industry and with authorities about different options that they have from the very onset, and talking about the possibility of tapping on regional, local, international suppliers and create diversification and competition that I think is in the best interest of final consumers. I think if you're aligned on the fact that that's what's going to drive the supply chain preference, then I think that's going to be a win-win. But I think we're still early stage in that sense.
What about the grid? I mean, the grid is always very important for any market, but specifically Vietnam, has had some constraints and challenges. What are your thoughts on the grid in Vietnam?
Yeah, I think the grid is a bit yeah, it's an interesting topic here, because they're usually capable grid operator. They're really like they're when we talk with them about smart grid and smart design, and we talk about digitization and demand response management, all these types of things, they're really knowledgeable. But it feels like there is a little bit of delay in implementation of technology. There is a little bit of I think, some capital constraints as well. And therefore, a lot of rollout of the grid needs to be prioritized by the top. Otherwise, it's not always likely to happen as organically as it should. This means that the interaction with government is quite essential, because what might seem natural development around, for example, demand centers or generation centers, it's not always going to happen as it should. And we know that we have a big gap in the middle of the country. There is a big demand center in the north, that is the capital city Hanoi, and then there's a big demand center in the south, that is the industrial capital Ho Chi Minh. And effectively, these two demand centers are not connected properly between them, and that whole skeleton it hasn't been reinforced if not occasionally. So it's quite not. I mean, you can't really have displaced or dispersed forms of energies, and therefore you cannot have an efficient power distribution without the interconnection of all the big demand centers, and therefore that forces you to develop the next projects as close as possible to demand center, by creating further congestion, both in terms of land, both in terms of use of substations and so on. So that's a quite critical point. Again, huge ambitions. I think there is a requirement for something like, and I don't remember how many billions, but I think more. I think at least $30 billion from now to 2030, just to be able to cater for the PPA projects in terms of grid investments. So there is huge shortage of capital, from what I can hear. But also there hasn't been a full opening of the transmission market that probably might help alleviate the situation.
That's exactly it. And it'll be interesting to watch over the next little while the amount of investment required for the grid, and then the openness of foreign investors, private capital to accelerate that, because there's a significant need, as you mentioned.
Absolutely, I think, and I guess there are some little experiments that have taken place. I think EDN, there is a network operator, allowed some private developers to build the grid and connect it to the central grid. I don't think there is yet, however, a model of compensation for that. It's very much a private negotiation how it happens. I think it'd be favorable for the industry if you could actually have, I don't know, a BOT system as it happens somewhere else, or OFTO system as it happens, for example, in the UK, to have this type of things that, would help remove some of the burden from the network operator, into private investors, and create a new asset class that is extremely attractive, because it obviously gives very stable returns.
Exactly. To your point, I mean, we do a lot of work on the OFTO in the UK, and that is a regulated, a very attractive asset class that attracts low-cost capital and really allows for, de-risking as well, and taking some of that off the shoulders of the offshore wind developers as well.
The trajectory is right. So for those who are observing the market, they might have noticed that there has been a new electricity law that has been approved recently, that set the foundations for liberalization. They allowed for decentralized power production. That is new, without too many authorizations. Effectively, it can be managed mostly at provincial level. You can directly sell the power to the off-taker, if it's a direct line. There's also something very interesting, is that the power retailer, as an entity, has been identified and has been acknowledged. So effectively now, what they call here industrial parks, these big areas, where you have industrial activities, can effectively have their own small power system, and they can generate and consume autonomously from the grid. And this is a big development. I think what we'd like to see next, obviously, is to have PPA framework, and we're like probably to I think we like to have more certain conditions for transmissions, and we like to have also like the possibility of doing virtual PPAs, because that would be the really game changer here in terms of energy distribution.
Like you mentioned, Vietnam checks a lot of the boxes, specifically around demand, GDP growth, ambitions. PDP-8 now, of course, has been delayed, but now, is finally out there. You recently signed a joint development agreement with PetroVietnam. I thought that was very interesting. In emerging markets, is a local state-owned enterprise partner a nice to have, or is it a must to have to de-risk projects for international investors?
Yeah, well, I come from oil and gas, so it's the norm there that you need to work with national oil companies in order to produce hydrocarbons, and many countries are defensive of their resources. And I think Vietnam is quite defensive of their resources, and therefore they decided that only state-owned enterprises could jumpstart this industry that they see potentially very profitable in the long term. So they wanted that the state-owned enterprise would develop the right knowledge to be able to manage these resources long term. And we embraced this philosophy, and we embarked into this collaboration with PetroVietnam, where I see it as a win-win, because obviously we can transfer a lot of technology and know-how, access to international capital, but they also have a fairly strong access to the industrial base, and also to access to communities, and they have very, very strong EPC, offshore EPC experience. So I think in theory is definitely a good partnership. And of course, we need to establish an operating model that works, that allows us to deliver the project at pace. And we are working on that.
And has the structure been finalized? Is it a 50-50 partnership, or how is it set up?
Yeah, it is a 50-50 joint decision making. I think the governance is not dissimilar from others that you have when usually you have a big state utility and the private player. Usually the state utility wants to have sort of controlling, or at least joint control kind of setup. So in that sense, it's not very unusual. I think here there is obviously there are some systems that and some policies that state-owned enterprises are tied up to, and therefore you need to respect. So you don't have the agility of working with a private company. You still work in the space of state spending, and therefore it requires a lot of control. It requires a lot of reporting. But the good thing is that once you have an established entity, they can somehow embrace new policies when it comes budgeting, when it comes to procurement. Still very high level of reporting, but it's much lighter than would it be if it was an non-incorporated JV.
I want to shift a bit to financing. Of course, we've seen financing projects in the North Sea. It's a well-oiled machine for offshore wind. In Vietnam, you're dealing with, as you mentioned, different structures around, PPA bankability standards, maybe the evolution. We're not there with virtual PPAs and so on. How do you structure a project to attract international lenders while keeping the power affordable for local government in Vietnam?
This is very much a live conversation. Right? So this is happening as we speak. Obviously, there is the expectation from the government that they are gonna, the kind of price level that they are going to anticipate to the generator is not going to be too high. And on the other hand, you have investors that look at this as a kind of growth economy, and therefore they have expectations of higher returns that you generally have in a more kind of established market. And I think this is where CIP is actually very, very strong, because you can do it. You have your infinite capital structure that could actually bridge this gap. But fundamentally, you need to look at what are the fundamental strengths of this setup. And for example, for Vietnam, it's obvious that there is a lot of development capital that want to participate. And you need to kind of have structures where you have strong support, strong guarantees by international lenders, international development agencies that do have a political theme, but also they see them under the lens of generating local wealth and know-how for the country, for the local enterprises take part into that. So I think that is important. But also I think the other aspect is you need to have a conversation around value generation and with the off-taker, and that is quite substantial, because if you look at it from the point of view of the government, effectively they're gonna pay for the power years after the capex has been deployed. So they have effectively there is no upfront risk. They only pay for the clean power that they generate, and this clean power is gonna bring substantial GDP. It's gonna bring substantial investment. So I think for a country like Vietnam, there is a growth. It's a growth economy with many investors waiting to establish their manufacturing plants here. It should be really a no-brainer, starting an industry that unlocks so much growth. Then you can optimize the capital, of course, to make it better. But in terms of value generation, it's an absolutely no-brainer for this country to start renewable energy at scale.
Obviously, you've spent a lot of time evaluating the opportunity of Vietnam. Have you seen any models in other industries or adjacencies where international investors have gained comfort and invested significantly in Vietnam yet?
Well, there has been the attempt by many international investors to get into LNG to power, because obviously that it's going to create a substantial demand for gas. And I think, however, we haven't seen that mode of taking off yet. I think we need to go back to oil and gas for seeing the last substantial international investments. And then you can go into coal investments, coal to power investments from Japanese and Koreans. I think there are quite a few of those, but they suffered recently as well. I would say that we haven't seen like material international investments in the energy sector now for quite some time. And I think so it's about time. There's a lot of pressure for that to happen, because there's been a huge delay in approving all sorts of projects. So it's not, and I think especially those that are linked to power that are the hardest to get off the ground, because there is this off-take issue where you need the counterparty guarantee, the state-owned enterprise EDN, and if they are not capable to give you those guarantees, it's difficult to do some kind of balance sheet financing for these projects. In fact, the only large energy projects in the country are done through corporate loans and local banks. But there is only, it isn't a hugely deep market, and therefore it comes with its limitations.
You've spent a lot of time working in different markets across Europe, Asia, and Middle East. And are there other emerging markets that you've seen kind of solve this hurdle that you'd like to point to as good examples?
Well, in terms of financing, I think that, I guess Taiwan is a success story. I wouldn't call it emerging market, I think, but I think the move from not having concept of project financing to actually now being kind of world leading in these kind of large energy infrastructures. I think that you need to take the good things from each country. I don't think there is a single country that nailed them all. I think, of course, we look at the UK as a model when it comes to revenue support with the CFD model. So I think eventually you want to see something like that once you get at a more mature stage of the market. But also the good thing of the UK is that they developed the framework by doing. And therefore, at every iteration of projects, they got it better and better. And I think they didn't try to overcomplicate it, if not recently, and then they had to track back, and because they had the CFD auction that didn't work very well. So I think that's a good market. I do think that there isn't a market that got it all right yet.
Yeah, exactly. We've seen similar. I mean, we see a big shift in what we do in terms of a move towards blended finance, for sure. Using development banks and ECAs, export credit agencies, to bridge the gap, especially for the first project. So, I can think of some of the work in Poland and some of the other markets that have had some success. But you're right, every market is unique.
Yeah, I think the I guess the trick here is just to understand, okay, what are the motivations that each party at the table has, and try to kind of work with that. And once you understand that, I think you build the credibility. Then I think it's easier to come to a successful frame for everyone. I guess in the case of Vietnam, they do want to progress with the energy transition. They want to do it in an affordable way, but they do believe that actually the energy transition is also going to be a leading force for their economic growth. And therefore, if you can demonstrate that behind an initial high price of power, there is actual jobs, there is actually technology transfer, there is the possibility of creating a more competitive supply chain. uh, I strongly believe that you can go and work very, very, very well, both with the government now and with the open market in the future.
Of course, today, we're spending a lot of time on Vietnam, but Alessandro, if you were sitting in front of a minister of energy from a new emerging market today, what are the top three areas they must have in place, both legally and industrially, to attract top tier developers?
Well, when it comes to power, you need to have a credible plan. So you need to have an ambition of a certain amount of capacity that makes sense in relation to the growth and the type of demand that you have in the country. Then you need to have supporting policies. And we have seen many examples of countries that have done an excellent job in doing the policies before they're going to kind of the full auction. I'm thinking of Central Europe, for example. Um, uh, and then I think third, but not last, is definitely you need to have an industrial plan. So if you don't have an industrial plan, you don't understand what are your strengths, what are the areas where you want to see your local industry thrive, then you're going to miss out an opportunity, because I think energy transition needs to be also just for the communities that host these assets, and they need to generate local growth.
What do you think the one big mistake that most emerging markets make when they're trying to get offshore wind off the ground?
I think that they aim too high, and then they don't implement what worked in other jurisdictions. So they think that they are unique, and therefore they can reinvent the wheel. While I think sometimes you just should take a model, start from there, and then fine tune it over time.
To wrap up our discussion here, Alessandro, I'd like to move away from the numbers and the metrics, more into the human and strategic side of leadership in frontier markets. You've spent a significant part of your career, with one of the world's big oil companies, BP, before moving to pure green with the COP. We often talk about energy transition as a shift in technology, but you've lived in a shift of culture. What is the one mindset from an oil and gas industry that you think offshore wind industry desperately needs to adopt? And what is the one habit from the old energy world that we need to have behind for good?
Well, honestly, I think it's a very interesting transition, and I never seen these two worlds competing one with the other. If anything, we are in a world of energy addition where you need oil and gas and you need more and more clean energy. But definitely, I noticed that what the clean energy industry could learn from oil and gas, I think, has to do with a kind of sense of discipline that you have in oil and gas, and the fact that you need to have continuous cost control. You need to have a lot of attention to details when it comes to engineer to design. I think this you have because oil and gas is an industry that has been around for more than a century, and therefore they got very strong processes and policies. I think at the beginning of the journey offshore wind probably paid the fact that lots of things had to be done on the go, and therefore you didn't have the same level of discipline, and then the consequences got paid later. So I think I think in that sense, I think now offshore wind has gone a long way, and what I see with CAP is actually extremely rigorous process. And in a way, you use the same stage gate process you'd use in oil and gas. Now you start with similar uh, health and safety standards, similar attention to program management, extremely detailed scenario analysis. And I think this comes from the world of oil and gas mostly. So there are many similarities. What we need to put behind, I think it's business that doesn't keep in consideration the consequences of what you do. So I think, for example, I what happens, what happens at the end of life of the asset, or what happens when we don't use that yard anymore. So I think it's about investing responsibly, having kind of full cycle analysis of the asset, and thinking that there are costs associated that you can't necessarily discharge to the next owner. You need to keep in mind, you might be the last owner, and you need to be responsible. Very often, you need collaborations of the stakeholders to address this. But yeah, I think clean energy comes with responsibility, because you're putting substantially more steel in the water that you could with a traditional oil and gas platform. So you need to know what's going to happen with that steel once the asset doesn't generate power anymore. So it's good habit that we keep that in mind, and we forget about being irresponsible.
And lastly, as a Frontier CEO, leading a 3.5 gigawatt project like you are in Vietnam with Lagan, it's not just about building a wind farm. It's about participating in the industrial revolution of a nation. When you look back 10 years from now, the Binh Thuan horizon is filled with turbines. What will you consider your personal win? Is it the gigawatt hours delivered to the grid, or is it the local Vietnamese engineers, that you've hired today and in the future, leading the development? Yeah.
Yeah, first, let me clarify that we are not going to put 3.5 gigawatts of assets in the water straight away. So the first phase is 1 gigawatt, and we need to get it right, because we need to create some industry standards. We need to kind of deliver some best practice. And I think that's probably the legacy I like to see. I like to see that, we created the right conditions for a new industry to thrive that contributes to the sustainable transition of this country. It's a country that is extremely beautiful. However, the air quality is not the best. The water quality is not the best. So what I want to see is actually that I can actually wake up in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh and see clear skies and clean air, not having to wear a mask. And I want to see, people enjoying their life outside in the parks. And that's not common view in the highly urbanized area of Vietnam at the moment. So for me, that's the final goal. Really. It's I think being proud of how it helped the sustainable transition of the country.
It's really about impact, and I think that's why we all do what we do. And thank you, Alessandro. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Till next time.
Thank you, Philip.